I was speaking to Josh Bongard yesterday, who is
Mm-hmm.
Mike Levin's collaborator in the creation of these Xenobots. These
Mm-hmm.
are cell aggregates of heart and skin cells from the Xenopus levis frog. And what they did was, there's no neurons, no brain cells. But what they did is they started modeling the calcium spiking patterns within these cells. And they realized that those patterns, when they really looked at what the structure of those patterns was, it was completely analogous to neuronal firing patterns in the brain. And then we were thinking like, well, what could be encoded in those calcium signals in this cell aggregate? And it seems to be doing all of these different learning and memory. It has differential gene expression. It does kinematic replication, which I know is controversial, and some people will say no, that's not replication because there's no gene transfer. But it's doing all these weird, strange agential behaviors, properties, features, and seems to me like that cell aggregate has experience. Now that's something between, a living biological organism and something that isn't. But do you think that the xenobots? I'm sure you're familiar with this work. Do you
Yeah.
think that a xenobot would be conscious? Would you ascribe second order perception to this lump of cells?
No, I'm not ready to rule it out. But my default opinion would be that, first of all, I don't really know. But is it actually necessary for producing such behavior to have that? And I know from that we can build things in computers that are producing very complicated patterns very easily. For instance, there is this artificial life community that people should look into. It's really beautiful. And they start out with all sorts of automata. An initial thing where it's Game of Life. It's a very simple cellular automaton which uses a Euclidean grid, so basically just little boxes in a rectangular alignment, and each of these boxes can contain a pixel or no pixel. So when there's a pixel in it, it's alive, and when it's empty, it's dead. And when a cell has exactly three neighbors, it comes alive. And when it has more than four neighbors, it dies because it suffocates. It has less than three neighbors, it dies because it's too lonely. And as a result, when we start with an initial pattern, just execute the simple function, we see an evolving pattern. And you can build stuff that looks a bit like organisms. You can build the gliders that are replicating themselves and moving around. You can even build
Interesting.
computers from them. And this still looks very mechanical because it's constrained to this very simple grid and it's just binary. And people extended this into a paradigm called linear. And the linear are moving in a continuous space. They can move in every direction, and they can have more or less continuous states in the cells of the computation. And as a result, you can build stuff that really looks like little organisms that you would see under your microscope, like little cells moving around and performing very complicated dances. And this looks really alive. That's why it's also called this artificial life community. But in order to behave like this, you just need to observe a set of very simple rules. And just by the application of these simple mindless rules, you get emergent, complex, organically looking behavior. Similar to another example is swarm behavior in birds. For to form these complicated swarm patterns, it's not necessary that the swarm has a mind of its own or that the individual birds are modeling the shape of the swarm. Instead, we can get the swarm behavior by letting every bird or every fish just follow a handful of very, very simple rules that only let them react mechanically, so to speak, to what they observe in their environment, what the other animals around them are doing. And as a result, you get this emergent pattern in their behavior. And so this leads me to think that I should be hesitant to ascribe intelligence or sentience or feeling or intentionality to everything that looks like it was complicated.
Yes, I
And
understand that.
so cells have all these mechanisms that are the result of evolution that leads to coherent behavior when the arrangement is correct. But it's not clear if the xenobots are sustainable individuals, right? They probably are not. You need to create a very specific environment so they can live out their days. And it's, I think a lot of the stuff that you observe there is ephemeral. But the basic idea that Michael Levin has is that organisms are less clear-cut as we make them out to be is probably very
Yes.
sound, and it's very inspiring. So this idea that an organism is more like a state of humans, like a country, and then it is like a single thing. And if a country dies, it's not like all the individuals die. Many individuals will die because they die of famine, but many also will try to move into the woods and survive and do something for as long as possible. And so maybe this is what Mike Levin is observing with the Xenobots. So if you isolate a few cells from the skin of the frog, they will try to make do and do as best as they can to build some local structure to survive. Not all creatures do this. Like when you take an ant from its nest, it gives up at some point, and because it has no purpose anymore. And
Yeah.
maybe this is also when you take humans away from their mission, many of them give up.
It seems tricky to me. So you're saying that if we accept that a frog is conscious, but 200 of its skin and heart cells aren't, there's some line in the sand between a frog and a clump of its cells that consciousness appears or emerges. That's what's tricky to me. I can completely understand that you can get very complex patterns that seem on the surface to be conscious, but there's no reason to believe it is. But then on the
Yes,
other side, it's very hard for me to draw the line in the sand. Like, where's the magic sauce? Where does it emerge? If there's somewhere between a frog and a clump of frog cells is a continuum of conscious to non-conscious, like, where's that line? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
a lot of people think that conscious is somehow on a continuum with different degrees on a continuum. And I don't quite observe this in myself. To me, consciousness seems to be binary. It can be lucid to different degrees, but this pattern
Interesting.
is either sparking itself into existence, it's igniting, or it's not. And it's really like an ignition when you wake up in the morning or when you come to in a dream, that you realize that consciousness is there. And if it's not there, you can be a sleepwalker even, right? You can be mindlessly uh, playing out automatic programs that you have acquired while you were conscious. But I'm either conscious or I'm not. It's almost like pregnancy. There is a gray area between being pregnant and non-pregnant, but it's not a stable, interesting realm where interesting stuff is happening. It's simply the phase transition. And so there is a phase transition while you space out, while you fall asleep and go into deep sleep, or a phase transition while you wake up from anesthesia or from deep sleep. But you're either there or not. And you can observe this in yourself, right? What it means to space out and lose consciousness and to fall asleep. And there's so many functions that you can perform, but not you, because you're only there when you're conscious. So that your organism can perform, that even your brain can perform while you're not conscious. Even coordinated action is possible to some degree, but it's not coherent. There is nobody home who is able to react and relate everything to a single vantage point. And so I suspect that consciousness is necessary when you want to relate everything to this single vantage point and create this coherent sense of now and agency. And for the other things, it might simply be not necessary.
So I understand that on a phenomenal consciousness level, you either are conscious or you're not. But there's also likely, as we've said, many different flavors of consciousness, as in a dog consciousness is different, cat consciousness, octopus consciousness. So do you
Well, I
think it's
think that
useful?
dogs and cats simply have a different personality. Their consciousness might be similar.
Do you think
So
it's useful to compare those levels of consciousness, the quantity of consciousness within a human compared to the quantity of consciousness within a dog? Is that a useful comparison?
yeah, I think if we take this, my attempt as a definition or characterization of consciousness from the beginning of the podcast seriously, that it's a second order perception, it's not quantitative, it's qualitative. You either perceive that you're perceiving or you don't perceive that you're perceiving. And so this waking up in the morning is that something notices that noticing is going on, right? The second order perception is happening. And it feels like an ignition to me. It's really that once this is fired up, it's able to make sure that the perception is continuing to go on and continue to make sense. And if you're spacing out again, there is no guarantee that your actions are continuing to make sense, and everything falls apart and fragments and dissociates and dissipates. So it seems that consciousness is the simple solution for creating a mind of a type like ours. And there is, of course, a difference in cats and dogs and humans. But it seems to be, for instance, a difference between cats and dogs is to which degree they are self-interested, or their reaction times are very different. Their aesthetics are very different. The way in which they relate to themselves in the world are very different. Cats are much more ornamental than dogs are for the most part, right? And much neater and much more self-interested, whereas dogs try to find somebody to latch onto and so less self-directed than cats are. But I think that they perceive themselves to be perceiving, and they can also do this for you. So basically, the dog notices that you are noticing that you are noticing. The dog is aware of the fact that you are conscious, and vice versa. So you can create this feedback across organisms where you share conscious states, where you basically have states together, where you build real-time feedback, real-time resonance, and create a shared now, which is one of the interesting features of consciousness, that it's necessary and facilitated for perceptual empathy, where you basically build shared mental states. And this is also a reason why it's, I think, quite undeniable that cats have to be conscious, because when you have a shared mental state with the cat, right, how would that work if the cat was not conscious?
Yes. No, I agree with you there. But what I'm still really curious on this categorical distinction between the Xenopus frog and the 2000 Xenopus frog cells, where one is conscious and one isn't. There has to
Yes.
be, like, if you so
So
what's the difference?
if you look at a government, for instance, if you put a gang together, they're not necessarily a government because it doesn't necessarily scale. Right? Even if the individuals build binary relationships between each other, uh, it doesn't scale. And if they build a reputation system across each other, it doesn't scale beyond the tribe, because it means that everybody has to keep the books on everybody else, right? And gossiping only gets you so far. And so a tribe is limited in its coordination. But to build something that makes an unlimited number of people do the same thing, like agriculture requires the specialization of across many different groups of people that need to coordinate. You need to give them a shared spirit. And so maybe consciousness is necessary to impose a shared spirit, a shared scalable agentic software on a very large set of sub-agents. And under which conditions this feels like something, I don't really know. That is something that I'm also not saying that the Xenobot is not conscious. I simply
Yeah.
don't know. And
Yes.
then when I ask myself, what would be the evidence for this? It would have to be that if I actually understand what it represents, and because I cannot talk to it, and I cannot have a shared mental state with it that I can recognize, I would need to be able to actually make it talk, right? And I can only do this by looking into representations that it builds inside of a simulation of the same behavior. So I don't see a good way to resolve this unless there is some kind of Weltgeist that has already made these experiments and then is then talking through Mike Levin or Stuart Hameroff or all these other modern mystics that feel that they have a greater certainty. Or maybe in fairness, I don't think that Mike Levin is certain of his interpretation of consciousness. It's simply that
Yes.
his null hypothesis is slightly different. And in some sense, the null hypothesis, that thing that you believe to be true by default, that you think that it's more likely to be true and you need evidence to get you away from it. In some sense, how do you get this null hypothesis? It's often a complicated conspiracy theory that you just happen to share with your environment. And for instance, there are cultures in which people are embarrassed that they see ghosts, and like ours. And
Yes.
there are other cultures where people are embarrassed when they cannot see ghosts. And in every culture, there are some people who can see ghosts and people who cannot see ghosts. And this
Yeah.
doesn't say whether ghosts are a hallucination of psychotic people, but some cultures per default say ghosts are a thing, and other cultures per default say ghosts are not a thing. And so what can move me over the evidential threshold in one way or the other is difficult, right? It would mean that a spirit can exist without a body or without a single body and can exist across bodies, maybe, right? In some sense, this is true for the spirit of a state or the spirit of a city or a family that, or a religion that can exist across many bodies. But can it be personalized and can it be conscious? an agentic in the same way as our own mind can be, that's a more difficult question. And so,
Yes.
as long as I don't have a criterion to determine this, I think I have to remain agnostic, which means I
Yes.
have to admit I really don't know this. It's an open question to me. Both is possible. I think this is more likely for these and these reasons, and this may be an experiment that would basically shift my belief in this direction of having more confidence in the opposite understanding.
I'm definitely agnostic as well. Of course, I can't know. We don't know, but it just it feels easier if you say that a frog is conscious. If you can't know that the clump of 2,000 frog cells is or isn't conscious, considering the frog is conscious, or we're accepting under this set of preconditions that we think the frog is conscious, it almost feels intellectually easier to just say, okay, well then probably the 2,000 cells are, because then I just don't
Okay,
know where
so here's a
you know what
slight
I mean?
argument that yes. So the reason why I think it might be possible that the body of is not conscious is that the body is limited in what it can do to itself. It seems to me that I can use my consciousness to restructure my mind, to rewrite my own source code. And sometimes it takes a very long time because there are so many dependencies. And there's a lot of structure that I built in my childhood before I knew what I was doing. And later I built structure that depends on me having built this child and how this child is doing things in me and is building the adolescent and then the adult and so on. But if I really direct my consciousness on these things, I can go into the child and fix a few things. And I can change the kind of mind that I am. There are many different architectures that can exist on the substrate of my brain. And I can access a range of them using my conscious activity to rebuild myself. And I don't observe this in organisms. If I lose an arm or a leg, I cannot just regrow it. Some organisms can do this to some degree, but these organisms tend to be more blobby and much smaller. And then I cannot also grow a third arm if I would find it practical, or change my anatomy using the consciousness of my body, even if that would be practical. So it seems to be that this process is more local adaptation, where something is reacting to the direct pressures of a local environment. And so this limited ability of my body to restructure itself rather than popping into a shape of a different phenotype if the environment demands it, like I can do when I role play a different person or a different psyche or a different job. Right? That is something that I cannot do. I cannot just change a role play my body into a different shape.
Yeah.
So this
It
might be an indication that the mechanism that organizes my body is not as powerful as and flexible as the mechanism that is optimizing my mind. So this is also no strong evidence to the contrary. It's still possible that simply bodies are maybe more rigid or harder to control or more stubborn. But it's also possible to say, oh, the body is organized according to less flexible, less self-aware, less self-reflexive principles. So the body might not actually know its shape as well as the mind is able to model the shape of the body.
Yes. This still feels like more of a quantitative difference than a qualitative. Like, I don't want to
Mhm.
make the claim that the xenobot is the same amount conscious as the frog. You know, it might be one
No,
billionth as his
but it's local versus global information. So the Xenobot itself does not actually seem to be structured in a way where the different parts need to know much about the other parts. Right? It's
I
maybe
wonder if Mike
possible
Levin would agree with that.
maybe it's sufficient for the Xenobot to know roughly in this direction there is a gradient to foot, and then it tries to rudder itself there, and then as an emergent phenomenon, it's mostly moving in the same direction. And maybe he has results that are showing that it's much more complex than that. But for the frog is able to discover a fly in the environment and target the fly and go after the fly. And I
Yes.
suspect that the Xenobot cannot make such a model of its environment and the place of the Xenobot in the environment. And the kind of model that we can make of our environment is more complicated than the frog can do because we can do reasoning. We can probably represent more complex geometries reliably and plan our paths through them and so on than the frog can. And this
I
is the
guess what
result of
I'm
basically our conscious attention that allows us to make this global model of reality.
Yes.
Yes.
I guess what I'm curious in understanding is what you think the minimal set of biological ingredients is for consciousness. Like, what's the absolute minimum ingredient list in terms of biological wetware, in terms of substrate that produces consciousness? And this is consciousness of any level or any degree, not human consciousness, frog consciousness, but just the absolute minimal set of biological wetware.
I suspect it's multicellularity and incentives to form coherence and long enough evolutionary time spans in the niche in which these incentives can come into play. So I am very open to the possibility that plants or forests are conscious, in the sense that it's that they have a notion of what it's like and some notion of real time, even if the real time is much, much slower than ours, much less resolved than ours. But that is, it's something where I think we can possibly find an answer via simulation experiments. And for cells, I'm less sure. For biological systems in nature, I'm also not sure, right? It's not completely out of the question that there are biological systems that are conscious. That imagine you have a gas planet and you have some storms on the gas planet and they exist for millions of years and they rotate metallic clouds and they create magnetic fields as a result, to which some of the clouds react slightly differently than others depending on the metals in there. And there is some feedback. And this whole thing is driven by tidal dynamics. And maybe at some point this wakes up and realizes, oh, I'm all alone in the universe, and maybe it's out of boredom. It creates the first cell, is some kind of a Neumann probe to colonize the universe. The cell is like this little robot. When you drop it on another planet, it's going to try to work and adapt itself and evolve and self-replicate. And in many environments, it might be able to take root. So once you have the first cell, life seems to be somewhat easy. But to get to the first cell is very hard. And maybe there are biological processes that are not self-replicating, but that are still able to wake up. But maybe Blaise Yagara is correct and others and say that self-replication is the first thing. And once you get to self-replication, sentience and intelligence follows. Right? And that is the default hypothesis that most people in the life sciences currently have, that basically self-replication is more elementary in mutation than mindedness and agency. And the other stuff basically results from this, right? But in principle, logically, it's possible that it's the other way around, and we just don't know at this point.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free